May 4, 1945. 27 miles off the coast of Okinawa. Seaman First Class Eugene Rawlings stood before the oscilloscope screen in the radar room of the USS Comfort, watching green phosphorescent traces sweep across the darkened glass while the hospital ship rolled gently in the afternoon swells. The air in the cramped compartment smelled of hot electronics and sweat. Rawlings wiped his palms against his trousers, his eyes never leaving the screen where clusters of blips marked the returning aircraft from the morning's combat air patrol. At 22 years old, the Iowa farm boy had been operating radar equipment for 18 months, long enough to read the ghostly signatures like a musician reading sheet music. Outside the steel bulkheads, the afternoon sun blazed across the Pacific, turning the water into hammered bronze. The Comfort, gleaming white with enormous red crosses painted on her hull and superstructure, moved through waters that had seen 3 days of continuous kamikaze attacks. Protected by international law as a hospital vessel, she carried over 200 wounded men in her wards below, men pulled from burning destroyers and shattered landing craft off the beaches of Okinawa. Rawlings adjusted the gain control, sharpening the images on his screen. His training officer at Pearl Harbor, Chief Petty Officer Malcolm Torres, had drilled into him the importance of pattern recognition, not just seeing what appeared on the scope, but understanding what belonged and what didn't. Every aircraft had a signature, a way it moved through the sky that left traces in the reflected radio waves. The largest cluster of blips began separating as the CAP aircraft peeled off toward their various carriers. Rawlings tracked each one, his pencil marking their positions on the plotting board beside his station. 3 Hellcats heading for the Essex, 4 Corsairs banking toward the Bunker Hill, 2 more Hellcats. He froze. One of those blips wasn't moving like the others. The formation aircraft were executing standard approaches, their returns steady and predictable as they descended toward their flight decks. But this single contact, tucked close behind a Hellcat, showed a different character entirely. The blip wavered slightly, its intensity flickering in a way that suggested lower altitude, slower speed. Rawlings leaned closer to the screen, his heart beginning to accelerate. "Sir!" he called to Lieutenant Marcus Flynn, the watch officer standing near the plotting table. "Contact bearing 270, range 18 miles. Something's not right." Flynn crossed the compartment in 3 strides. At 34, the former mathematics teacher from Massachusetts had developed a reputation for trusting his operator's instincts. He bent to examine the scope, his eyes narrowing as he tracked the anomalous return. "What am I seeing, Rawlings? Looks like he's shadowing that Hellcat, sir. But the signature's all wrong." Rawlings tapped the glass beside the blip. "Returns are weaker than they should be for a fighter at that range. And the movement, see how it's drifting slightly? That's not formation flying." Flynn studied the screen for another 5 seconds. The war had taught him that hesitation killed men, but so did premature action. Hospital ships operated under strict neutrality. They carried no weapons, flew no combat air patrol of their own, depended entirely on their protected status and the surrounding fleet for defense. But that same neutrality made them impossible targets to resist for pilots already committed to dying. "IFF interrogation," Flynn ordered. Rawlings switched on the identification friend or foe transponder system, sending out the coded challenge that would prompt a friendly aircraft to respond with the proper signal. The Hellcat's return immediately painted with the characteristic double pulse that marked it as American. The following aircraft showed nothing. "Negative IFF, sir." Flynn straightened, his jaw tightening. "Sound general quarters. Get me a range and bearing update every 30 seconds. He reached for the sound-powered phone connecting the radar room to the bridge. "Bridge, sick. We have a possible hostile contact bearing 270, range 17 miles and closing. Single aircraft, no IFF response." Above them, the general quarters alarm began its urgent clanging. Throughout the Comfort, men grabbed life jackets and scrambled toward their emergency stations, though for a hospital ship, those stations meant primarily securing patients and preparing for casualties rather than manning guns that didn't exist. The ship's only defense was her white paint and those red crosses, symbols that had already proven tragically unreliable in these waters. Rawlings kept his eyes locked on the scope. The bogey had closed another mile, still tucked behind the Hellcat. Range 16 miles. The hospital ship made barely 12 knots. There would be no evasive maneuvering, no high-speed turns. If that aircraft meant to attack, it would reach them in under 10 minutes. "Bearing 268, range 15 miles, Rawlings reported, his voice steadier than he felt, still shadowing the Hellcat. "Altitude appears to be decreasing." On the bridge, Captain Roger Dennison received Flynn's report with the grim calm of a man who had already buried too many sailors in the past week. The 50-year-old physician from Baltimore had commanded the Comfort since her commissioning, transforming a converted luxury liner into a floating surgical theater that had saved thousands of lives. Now he stood at the center of the pilot house, surrounded by junior officers whose faces had gone pale. "Communications, raise that Hellcat on guard frequency," Dennison ordered. "Warn them they're being shadowed." The radio operator's voice crackled across the bridge speakers moments later. "Navy 324, Navy 324, this is USS Comfort. You have an unidentified aircraft in trail, 2 miles aft. Acknowledge." Static hissed from the speaker. Then, "Comfort, 324. Say again your last? 324? You are being followed by an aircraft without IFF. Possible hostile. Suggest immediate evasive action." A pause. Then the pilot's voice came back, higher-pitched, urgent. "Comfort, breaking now. I see him, Jesus. He's dropping back and turning toward you. Single engine job, looks like a 0. In the radar room, Rawlings watched the two blips separate. The Hellcat pulled away in a climbing turn, its return strengthening as it gained altitude. The bogey continued inbound, now clearly committed to an attack run. Range 12 miles. Speed approximately 180 knots. "Target has separated from friendly aircraft," Rawlings called out. "Bearing 265, range 11 miles, inbound at high speed. Course steady on our position." Flynn grabbed the phone again. "Bridge, sick. Hostile confirmed. Time to contact approximately 4 minutes." Throughout the Comfort, men performed the choreography of survival they'd rehearsed dozens of times. In the wards, corpsmen strapped patients into their bunks and distributed life jackets to those who could wear them. In the operating rooms, surgeons completed emergency procedures while nurses prepared to move critical cases to the most protected spaces below the waterline. On the weather decks, crew members who couldn't help below stood watching the sky, their eyes searching for the black speck that meant death. Rawlings watched the blip crawl across his screen with mathematical precision. Range, 10 miles. 9. The phosphorescent dot pulsed with each sweep of the radar beam, steady and remorseless. His hands trembled slightly as he updated the bearing 263 degrees, still tracking directly toward the ship's center mass. "Sir, we need to get word to the escorts," he said. "The destroyers might be able to intercept." Flynn was already on it, passing targeting data to the destroyer screen positioned 5 miles out. But both men knew the mathematics were grim. The nearest destroyer was 12 miles away, oriented toward a different sector. Even at flank speed, she couldn't reach an intercept position in time. The CAP fighters were scattered, some already landing on distant carriers, others too far out of position. The hospital ship was alone. Range 7 miles, Rawlings reported. His mouth had gone dry. Descending through 3,000 feet based on signal strength, speed holding steady. On the open bridge wing, Ensign Harding scanned the western sky through binoculars. At 26, the nurse from Oregon had volunteered for sea duty after her brother died at Guadalcanal. She'd held men's hands as they died, had waded through blood on surgical room floors, had learned to sleep through the sound of distant explosions. But this was different. This was watching death approach with the certainty of a falling stone. "There," someone shouted. 2 o'clock high. She swung her binoculars toward the heading. A black speck materialized against the blue sky, growing larger by the second. The aircraft was descending in a gentle glide, its engine throttled back to reduce detection, an old kamikaze tactic that sometimes fooled less experienced radar operators. But Rawlings had caught it, had read the subtle signature differences that marked predator from prey. The 0 grew in her field of view. She could make out the distinctive lines of the Japanese fighter, could see the fixed landing gear and the dark cockpit canopy. Somewhere inside that aircraft sat a young man, probably her age, who had written his farewell letters and accepted his death, who had drunk his ritual's sake and tied his hachimaki headband, and climbed into a machine laden with enough fuel for a one-way trip, who would, in approximately 3 minutes, attempt to crash into the ship where she stood. Range 5 miles, Rawlings called, bearing steady, altitude approximately 1,500 feet. Flynn stared at the scope, his mind racing through options that didn't exist. Hospital ships carried no anti-aircraft guns, no defensive missiles, nothing but their protected status under international law, a status that meant nothing to a pilot who had already discarded his own life. The surrounding destroyers were opening fire, their 5-inch guns creating a curtain of flak between the attacker and his target. But the range was extreme and the 0 small and maneuverable. Rawlings watched the blip pulse across his screen. Range 4 miles. 3. The aircraft had leveled off at 1,000 feet, setting up for its terminal dive. In seconds it would push over, accelerating toward the white ship with its red crosses, toward the wounded men in the wards below, toward the surgeons bent over their tables, toward the 200 crew members who had saved thousands of lives, and now stood helpless before a single determined attacker. His mind flashed to his training, to Torres's voice drilling them on radar theory. Radio waves reflecting off metal surfaces, signal strength proportional to the target's radar cross-section. the oscilloscope showing only what the electromagnetic spectrum revealed, translating invisible waves into visible patterns. And then, watching the steady pulse of that approaching blip, Eugene Rawlings understood something. The zero appeared on his screen because its metal frame reflected the radar waves back toward the ship. The stronger the return, the better the target for the radar, but also for anyone defending against it. What if he could make the aircraft seem to be somewhere it wasn't? "Lieutenant," he said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "Permission to try something." Flynn turned from the scope. "What?" "I can't shoot him down, sir. But maybe I can make him miss." There was no time for lengthy explanations. Flynn looked at the young seaman's face, saw something there beyond fear, and made the same kind of snap decision that had kept him alive through 18 months of war. "Do it." Rawlings's hands moved across the radar controls with sudden purpose. The system could be adjusted to vary its output, higher power for maximum detection range, lower power for close-in work. But it could also be pulsed, cycled through rapid changes that might, just might, interfere with whatever equipment the Kamikaze pilot was using to guide his final approach. He pushed the power selector to maximum, flooding the air with electromagnetic energy. On the screen, the target's return blazed bright. Then he snapped it to minimum, cutting the output to barely above background noise. The blip faded. Maximum again. Minimum. He established a rhythm, cycling the radar output through rapid variations that would send confused, contradictory signals to any receiver tuned to their frequency. On the bridge, Dennison watched the Zero begin its dive. The aircraft rolled inverted, then pulled through into a steep descent, its engine howling as the pilot pushed the throttle forward. Black smoke streamed from the exhaust. The ship's wake boiled as the helmsman threw the wheel hard over, trying to present a narrower target despite knowing the futility. 12 knots wasn't enough speed to meaningfully change position in the seconds remaining. Harding gripped the railing, unable to look away. The Zero filled her binocular view now, growing with terrible speed. She could see the red circles on the wings, could see the bombs slung beneath the fuselage, could almost imagine the pilot's face behind that dark canopy. The aircraft steadied on its attack angle, lined up perfectly with the ship's superstructure. In the radar room, Rawlings cycled his controls faster. Maximum, minimum, maximum. His eyes flicked between the scope and the stopwatch mounted beside his station. Range 1 mile. 30 seconds to impact. His hands blurred across the panel, adjusting frequency slightly, varying the pulse timing, creating a symphony of electromagnetic interference that radiated from the ship's antenna in invisible waves. He had no idea if it would work, had no proof that the Kamikaze pilot was even using radio equipment to refine his aim. Many relied purely on visual targeting, accepting the crude accuracy it provided. But some of the newer Kamikazes, the ones from the organized Tokutai special attack units, carried simple radio homing devices that could lock onto a ship's electromagnetic emissions. And those devices depended on steady signals, predictable returns they could track during the final approach. What they couldn't track was chaos. The Zero roared downward, its dive angle steepening.
800 yards.
600. Harding saw the pilot make a small correction, the aircraft's nose shifting slightly left. Then another correction, this time to the right. The movements seemed larger than they should be, almost uncertain. The plane wobbled slightly, as if flying through turbulence in the clear afternoon air. 400 yards. The ship's crew braced for impact. Men grabbed whatever was bolted down. Prayers were muttered in a dozen different languages. Time seemed to slow, stretching seconds into eternities as the screaming aircraft filled the sky. Rawlings kept cycling his controls, sweat running down his face. He couldn't see what was happening outside. The radar room had no windows, was buried deep in the ship's superstructure. All he had was the scope, and the scope showed only that the blip had merged with their own position. Whether that meant impact or something else, the screen couldn't tell him. 200 yards. 100. The Zero's shadow flashed across the water. Dennison saw the pilot's helmet, saw the white Hachimaki headband, saw the determination in the way the aircraft held its course despite the wobbling corrections. 50 yards. 25. And then the Zero jerked hard to the right. The movement wasn't a correction, it was violent, abrupt, the kind of maneuver that spoke of disorientation. The aircraft's nose pulled up slightly as it crossed the ship's beam, climbing perhaps 20 feet as it passed. The bombs slung beneath its fuselage cleared the Comfort's main mast by less than 30 yards, so close that men on the weather decks could see the arming wires trailing from the ordnance. The Zero roared past the starboard side and slammed into the ocean 200 yards beyond, hitting the water at nearly 300 knots. The impact was catastrophic. The aircraft disintegrated in a fountain of spray and debris, the bombs detonating half a second later in a massive underwater explosion that sent a column of white water 200 feet into the air. The shockwave rolled across the sea, rocking the Comfort slightly as it passed beneath her hull. Then there was silence, broken only by the sound of the ship's engines and the distant thunder of anti-aircraft fire from the destroyer screen, still laying down protective barrages against threats that might follow. In the radar room, Flynn and Rawlings stared at each other. The lieutenant's hands were shaking as he picked up the sound-powered phone. "Bridge, sick. Target has splashed. We're clear." On the bridge, Dennison stood motionless for 5 full seconds, his mind processing what he'd just witnessed. Then he keyed the internal communications system. "All stations, Captain speaking. Secure from general quarters. The threat has passed. Well done, everyone. Well done, everyone. Well done." Harding lowered her binoculars with trembling hands. The water where the Zero had crashed was still churning, littered with floating debris, pieces of aluminum skin, fragments of wooden propeller, and oil slick spreading across the surface. No parachute had appeared. The pilot had ridden his aircraft into the sea, his mission failed by the narrowest of margins. Below decks, the surgeons returned to their operating tables. The patients, strapped into their bunks, began breathing again. The ship settled back into its rhythm of healing, of mending broken bodies and salvaging shattered lives. But throughout the Comfort, men and women stood in small groups, talking in low voices about how close death had come, about how the Kamikaze had jerked away at the last possible instant, about the margin of 30 yards that separated survival from catastrophe. In the radar room, Rawlings sat at his station, staring at the scope where the target blip had vanished. His hands had stopped shaking, but his mind was racing, replaying those final seconds over and over. He couldn't be certain. Couldn't prove that his electromagnetic interference had caused the pilot's confusion. Maybe it had been mechanical failure, or divine intervention, or simple human error at the moment of death. Flynn stood behind him, one hand resting on the young seaman's shoulder. "You want to tell me what you just did?" Rawlings explained his theory, how the varying radar output would have created confusion for any radio homing device, how the rapid frequency changes would have sent contradictory signals that made the target appear to shift position, how a pilot making fine adjustments in the final seconds of his dive, relying partially on electronic guidance, might have overcorrected, might have been thrown off just enough to miss. "I don't know if it worked, sir," he finished. "Could have been anything. Could have been luck." Flynn looked at the scope, then back at Rawlings. "Maybe. But I saw that aircraft wobbling on its approach, saw those corrections that got bigger instead of smaller. That's what happens when someone's getting confused signals. That's what happens when the data doesn't match what their eyes are telling them." He straightened, his voice taking on a formal tone. "I'm putting you in for a commendation, Rawlings. What you did was think under pressure, was adapt to an impossible situation. That's worth recognition. But recognition, when it came, would be quiet and restricted." The Office of Naval Intelligence took immediate interest in Rawlings's report. Within a week, a commander from O&I flew out to interview him, to understand exactly what he'd done and why. The implications were profound if radar could be used defensively, if its emissions could be manipulated to confuse enemy guidance systems, then an entirely new category of electronic warfare might be possible. The technique Rawlings had improvised that afternoon would be classified, studied, and refined over the following months. By the time the war ended in September, ships throughout the Pacific Fleet carried new protocols for radar operation during kamikaze attacks, protocols that owed their existence to a young Iowa farm boy who had understood that defense wasn't only about armor and guns, but about the invisible spectrum of electromagnetic radiation that surrounded every ship. For Rawlings himself, the moments after the attack brought only exhaustion and the slow realization of what might have been. He remained at his post for the rest of his watch, tracking the CAP flights as they completed their landings, monitoring the destroyer screen as it shifted position to cover new threat vectors. His eyes burned from staring at the scope. His hands ached from gripping the controls. When his relief arrived 4 hours later, he climbed to the weather deck and stood at the railing, watching the sun sink toward the western horizon. The sea stretched empty in all directions, peaceful and deceptive. Somewhere out there, other kamikazes were taking off from airfields in Kyushu. Other pilots were tying on their headbands and climbing into cockpits for their final flights. The war ground on with mechanical inevitability. But today, on this ship, 200 wounded men would live to see tomorrow. Surgeons would complete their operations. Nurses would change dressings and hold hands and whisper encouragement. And all of them would owe their survival to a margin of 30 yards and the quick thinking of a radar operator who had understood that sometimes the best defense was making the enemy doubt what they thought they knew. Harding found him there an hour later, staring at the darkening water. She stood beside him in silence for a while, both of them watching the last light fade from the sky. "I heard what you did," she said finally. "The whole ship's talking about it." Rawlings shook his head. "Could have been anything. Could have been luck. Could have been," she agreed. "But I saw that plane. I saw how it moved at the end, like the pilot couldn't hold his course. That wasn't luck. That was you." He turned to look at her, saw the certainty in her face. "How many men are below decks right now? How many would have died if he'd hit us?" 197 patients, she said. Plus crew. 300 people, maybe more. The number hung between them in the gathering darkness. 300 lives, preserved by seconds and yards and electromagnetic interference. Rawlings felt the weight of it, felt the profound responsibility of choices made in crisis. He had acted on instinct and theory, on half-remembered training and desperate innovation. It might have worked. It might have been coincidence. He would never know with certainty. But he knew this. When death had come screaming out of the sky, he had not frozen. He had not accepted the inevitable. He had thought and acted and tried something new. In the chaos of war, that was all anyone could do. The Comfort remained on station off Okinawa for 6 more weeks, receiving casualties from the bloody ground fighting that would claim over 12,000 American lives before the island was secured. She survived 2 more near misses from Kamikaze attacks, neither as close as that afternoon in early May. Each time Rawlings was at his scope, his hands ready on the controls, prepared to flood the air with electromagnetic confusion if needed. The war ended in September. The Comfort returned to San Francisco in October, her wards still full of wounded men. Rawlings was transferred to a shore station in San Diego, where he spent the next year teaching radar theory to new operators, passing on the lessons he had learned. He never spoke publicly about what happened that afternoon, bound by the classification that surrounded the technique. But his students learned the importance of understanding their equipment, of thinking beyond the manual, of recognizing that technology could be adapted and improvised in ways its designers never intended. He returned to Iowa in 1947, married a school teacher from Des Moines, and raised 3 children on a farm outside Cedar Rapids. He worked as an electronics technician, then as an engineer for a radio manufacturer, applying the skills the Navy had taught him. On quiet evenings, sitting on his porch and watching the sun set over fields of corn, he would sometimes think about that afternoon in the Pacific, about the zero that had passed overhead so close he could have hit it with a stone. And he would think about Paula Harding, who had written him letters for years after the war, who had gone on to become a hospital administrator in Portland, about Marcus Flynn, who had trusted a young seaman's instinct when every second counted, about Roger Dennison, who had commanded with calm dignity even when death approached, about all the men and women who had stood on the Comfort that day, doing their jobs with quiet competence while the world tried to kill them. Most of all, he thought about the 300 people who had lived, because one person understood that defense wasn't only about destroying the enemy, but about making them miss, about creating uncertainty at the moment when certainty mattered most, about the power of information and misinformation and the invisible waves that filled the air around us carrying truth and lies in equal measure. The technique he pioneered that afternoon would evolve, would become part of the complex science of electronic warfare that defined naval combat for generations. Modern ships would carry sophisticated jamming equipment, would employ dedicated electronic warfare officers, would fight battles in the electromagnetic spectrum that never involved a single bullet. But the principle remained the same: understanding that the enemy's perception could be as important as the physical reality, that victory sometimes came not from being the strongest, but from making your opponent doubt their own instruments. Eugene Rawlings died in 1993, having lived to see radar technology transform from the crude oscilloscopes of his youth to the digital systems that could track hundreds of targets simultaneously. His obituary in the Cedar Rapids Gazette mentioned his Navy service but included no details about his wartime accomplishments. The classification on his actions had been lifted years before, but he had never sought recognition, had never told his story beyond the technical reports filed in 1945. But in the archives of the Naval Historical Center, his after-action report remains, documenting the afternoon when a 22-year-old radar operator saved 300 lives with quick thinking and an understanding of electromagnetic theory. It sits alongside similar reports from thousands of other sailors, soldiers, and airmen who had adapted, improvised, and overcome when the situation demanded it, who had turned theory into practice, had transformed training into action, had proven that the human mind remained the most powerful weapon in any arsenal. The hospital ship Comfort survived the war, was decommissioned in 1946, and was scrapped in 1955. But her legacy lived on in the thousands of men she had saved, in the surgical techniques perfected in her operating rooms, in the lessons learned about maintaining humanity amid industrial slaughter, and in the story of a young radar operator who understood that sometimes the best way to survive was to make the enemy uncertain, to fill the air with electronic noise that turned certainty into doubt and precision into confusion. On a peaceful May afternoon in 1945, death had come within 30 yards of 300 lives. It had missed, pulled off course by invisible interference, by electromagnetic waves manipulated in ways never intended by their designers. Whether by luck or by design, by coincidence, or by innovation, the result was the same: survival, when destruction had seemed inevitable. And in the radar room of a hospital ship off Okinawa, Eugene Rawlings had learned the lesson that would define his life: that knowledge was power, that understanding was survival, and that sometimes the quietest victories mattered most. If you have enjoyed the story, tell YouTube to send you more stories like this by subscribing to this channel, liking the video, and leaving a comment.